We've now recording and ready to get started. And I'll just be direct, right? We are now I think a month and a half into this lecture series. We having paused a couple times for current events. We will continue to return, circle back to current events. There's been some major developments in terms of what came out of the UN climate change conference. At least what's on paper there is an acknowledgement for the first time that in order to get climate change under control, we need to do something about fossil fuel use. Maybe a baby step, but at least a step in the right direction. Obviously, big developments in Israel as the war in Gaza grinds on, developments domestically, in part to do with support for Israel and the Ukraine, in part to do with ongoing investigations into the former president, in part to do with the buildup to the current election. All of that is stuff that I hope to come back to, certainly by the end of the year, in kind of a synthetic way to reflect on what happened last year and what we can anticipate coming as we enter a presidential election year in 2024. But before doing that, I do want to try to bring this lecture series to a close. And as I've said to you on several occasions now, the impetus, the reason to focus on making democracy work better in the buildup to a national election is because it seems to me that until democracy starts being repaired, and until we undertake the difficult and extraordinarily risky work of trying to fix our democracy, we are likely to continue to bounce back and forth, pendulum like, between politicians, presidential candidates in particular, Democrats especially, who try to campaign on the basis of hope, on the basis of reform, on the basis of the idea that we can make our institutions and our polity and our society work better, and then, right, who often win power. And yet, at the end of 4 years, at the end of 8 years, the feeling of many people is that although some important legislation has been passed, although perhaps things are not as bad as they would be if that legislation weren't passed, nevertheless, the majority of us don't feel that these institutions are actually doing what we want them to do. And that leads us to be tempted to be angry, to be bitter, to engage in a politics of grievance, to look for scapegoats to blame for the dysfunction in our politics. And then we alternate into a different kind of president, a different kind of politician, typically a Republican. At least for the last quarter century or so, the Republicans have been much better at channeling anger and grievance into electoral politics and finding the scapegoats to blame: immigrants, liberals, African Americans, elites, and then frankly passing legislation that tends to increase the sense that our society is dysfunctional and unfair, and then further amplify the basis for a politics of resentment. Nevertheless, after 4 years or 8 years of Republican leadership, many people feel that the politics of grievance, anger, anxiety have not delivered the goods either. And so we swing back to the other pendulum. And this is not a productive place for our politics to be in. And in particular, it does appear that the swing to the right is going further and further to the right in these cycles, and in a sense dragging the left further to the right as well. And that the result is that we are in a dangerous place for American politics. I put images of the right Congress being invaded, of the Supreme Court appearing to be more of a haunted house than a forum of principle, and then of Kristallnacht, of the burning of, I'm sorry, not Kristallnacht, the Reichstag fire, the death of German democracy, as a warning to what happens when we neglect the difficult project of updating, repairing, maintaining our democracy. And I've tried to suggest to you an overall framework for thinking about this in terms of the idea that democracy is not established all at once when a democratic constitution is ratified. As a matter of fact, the Constitution we ratified had many deficiencies with regards to democracy, and it has taken centuries of struggle, of reform, of amendment, of change in the practice of democracy and the interpretation of the Constitution and the nature of our society for us to become a more democratic society. And yet, that work is necessarily ongoing, and I want to suggest mainly stalled for something like the last half century. So today I'm going to look primarily at the idea of what I've called the second fork. If there are two approaches to reform, one of them repairing the institutions that we already have, the other considering new institutional innovations that perhaps better realize the idea of democracy. Maybe we should explore the second fork as well. And so that's where I want to go. I've got here a contrasting image I've used with you before, the Diego Rivera Detroit Industrial Museum mural, which has a very solidaristic image of the workplace and in a sense of society. And then Pierre Monet's The Old Musician, which is an image of marginalization, of people being pushed out as Paris is modernized with no place to go, and then staring right back at you in a kind of accusatory way. How can you, in good conscience, modernize our city by pushing us out of it? And I think, in a sense, this is very much the feeling that many workers have with regard to the American economy, perhaps many citizens have with regard to the American polity, that yes, we have a post-industrial technology information economy. Yes, we have a multiracial, post-traditional polity and society. But are the people who previously felt incorporated in our society adequately included in it in its 21st century iteration? Are the people who have been marginal or oppressed for a very long time better included in the 21st century? If not, what can we do to better include them? Is it just fixing our old institutions, or do we perhaps need some new institutions as well? You will remember that last week we were talking about the work of Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, two of the leading American political scientists who study the comparative politics of authoritarian rise within democratic societies. And their book, How Democracies Die, got a lot of attention during the Trump presidency, in that it used a historical metric to try to name and list the attributes of would-be authoritarian leaders. And it turned out Donald Trump scored far higher on that list than any previous American president. And I will just point out to you again, when sounding the alarm about American democracy, the idea that Donald Trump is a viable political candidate, right? And for the highest office in the land, I think that maybe even underestimates what the polls are saying right now. I do want to be as clear as possible. I don't think the polls in September through December of 2023 are predictive of what's going to happen in November of 2024, but they are indicative of a mood in the country, and a mood that is willing to give perhaps a second chance to a man who makes no bones about his authoritarian tendencies. The Levitsky and Zablat did all this work, and Trump, in a sense, has just verified what they're saying through his recent stances. And so this has led them to write a second book published this year, Tyranny of the Minority, which argues that it's not the majority of Americans who support the kind of politics that Donald Trump embraces, but it is a very large, highly mobilized minority, and our institutions open themselves to minority tyranny, to the minority actually being able to govern, use power, and suppress the majority in circumstances like those we face as a country. We looked at this in detail. I don't want to go into this again, but whether we're talking about the Senate and its principle of representation, the way in which the Electoral College now, it appears, regularly threatens to award the presidency to the loser of the popular vote, the combination of the Senate and the presidency and the way that shapes the Supreme Court to be not only unaccountable, but also at this point much more attuned to the views of a single party and a party that represents a minority of Americans' views. Those views are amplified and empowered by the Supreme Court, gerrymandering, and then the difficulty of fixing all of this via the Constitution. We have, with all of this in focus, a very clear temptation for a party that is losing majority support to not undertake the risky project of realignment, of reconstituting its coalition, its constituency, its basis of support. In the Republican case, this would mean primarily appealing to non-white voters, maybe to recent immigrants, to people who are less traditional, less Christian, less old. And rather than doing that, the Republican Party says, wait a sec, we've got all of these ways in which, if we get enough of the supporters we have mobilized to vote, we can nevertheless gain and keep power. And by the way, Donald Trump is kind of electoral catnip for those voters. He gets them going. So maybe we have an alternative to the risky business of realignment. The result has been the takeover of the Republican Party by the populist authoritarian right, represented by Donald Trump, but increasingly by MAGA Republicans. And we continue to see more traditional Republicans running for the doors as we approach another election. We see this in the leadership of the House and in the recent transition, but we also see it in rank and file Republicans, ordinary voters, 70% of whom believe, right, that the previous election may have been stolen. And again, another label, let me see if I did it in the next slide. No, I didn't. Would be that the grand old party, the party of Lincoln, has become the bullhorn for propaganda and disinformation, right? Again, right, 56% of Republican voters believe that Trump is being indicted and ultimately will be prosecuted, presumably because, not that he did anything wrong, but because he stands up for people like you. And the liberal elite are so entrenched and so threatened by someone who represents people like you that they would rather weaponize the Department of Justice, the federal judiciary, to take him down than allow him to compete for the presidency again. And so if this is then the central conclusion of Levitsky and Zablat's work, not the view of the majority of Americans, but a view that works to mobilize a minority that is large enough that they can hope to gain power, given the way our institutions amplify the power of minorities, then in a sense we have not only Donald Trump and the Republican Party and its funders and backers and leaders to blame for all of this. We also, of course, have Fox News and social media. But additionally, we have our Constitution to blame for this. The way in which the Constitution opens the door to minority tyranny structurally encourages the Republican Party to take this path. And the result is, in addition to the rather graphic examples I listed on the previous slide, that the Republican Party has become a ideological outlier in the democratic world in terms of its lack of respect for liberal democratic principles, norms, and practices, and its opposition to ethnic minority rights. So we looked last week at a number of proposals that Levitsky and Zablat offer, from a number of ways of making it easier to vote, a number of ways of protecting the right to vote, and making the administration of elections nonpartisan and so above suspicion, to efforts to make our institutions more responsive to majority vote, more proportionate and accountable in the way in which they operate. I'm going to assume that this is all reasonably familiar. I'm going to focus because at the very end, David asked me a question if I could go further in talking about replacing single member winner take all with multi-member proportional districts. And if you remember, this goes hand in glove with a proposal to expand the House of Representatives. I will just point out to you, I did a little bit more research into, right, how big the discrepancy is between where our legislature is, our House of Representatives, relative to the population of the United States. This diagram shows we're a distant outlier from the rest of the democratic world. The research I did, I asked, what is the average constituency size for a legislature in most of the rest of the democratic world? And it's a little bit over one representative per 100,000 voters. In the United States, it's one representative per 450,000 voters. And so we are way out there in terms of being, 4 or 5 times larger in our average constituency per representative than most of the rest of the democratic world. And this attenuates the relationship between the representative and those they represent. They're representing 4 or 5 times as many people. It makes it much more difficult for them to have a sense of where the people they represent stand on issues. And in addition, it makes it much more expensive to organize our politics, and so much more likely that the representative is, in a sense, going to give up on the very difficult task of trying to figure out what 500,000 people want them to do, and instead do what the donors who give them the money that's necessary to campaign in a district that includes 400,000 or 500,000 people, that that creates this structural vulnerability. Now, the idea that we could do two things at once, right? On the one hand, expand the size of the house. And I want to say we should add at least 200 to 300 members to the House. This still would not actually remedy the issue, right? Which is the stagnation of that size of the House from the beginning of the 20th century to, we're now beginning to approach the middle of the 21st century, for 120 odd years. In part, we need 300 new members to um, bring the representative closer to the people they represent. But in addition, we need multi-member districts elected via a mechanism of proportional representation. And so this is a diagram that shows in a little bit more detail what this would do, right? And so Texas, which is a rather gerrymandered state, currently has, right, uh 20, I'm sorry, 36 single member districts, right? This is the way in which districts are organized throughout the United States. I did a little bit more research into this, and it turns out there's a 1967 Act of Congress that requires that districts be single member districts. So a piece of legislation would have to be changed. The impetus for that piece of legislation, in a sense, was a good intention. The Supreme Court in Baker v. Carr had just held, and in reaction to Jim Crow gerrymandering, that the principle of one person, one vote needed to be reflected in the way in which we apportion congressional representation. And Congress felt that multi-member districts were allowing, in particular, southern states to do mischief in diluting the power of African American votes. And so they required every state to have single member districts. You can only vote for one member of Congress. Where you are determines who you can vote for. If you live in Berkeley, California, and it is a dominantly Democratic area and you happen to be a Republican, well, too bad for you. You will almost never, unless there's some kind of sea change, probably be elected in your, I'm sorry, represented in your lifetime by somebody who's uh, uh, who your vote actually got into office. You're going to be a permanent minority, right? And so if we were to take Texas and instead create, and as you can see, there are, as opposed to the 36 districts, now 30 over 40 representatives, because the House has been expanded, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 multi-member districts. And so, for instance, in Houston, which is a dominantly Democratic area, there would be two, in one of the multi-member districts, likely two Democratic, likely two Republican, and maybe one toss-up, right? And so what you end up with is a number of representatives who are more proportionate to the way in which the state votes. If the state votes 55% Republican, 45% Democratic, there should be roughly, right, 55% of the representatives, as opposed to maybe 2/3 of the representatives, Republican, and roughly 45% Democrat, as opposed to 1/3. And so the mechanism of proportional representation in a multi-member district allows us to basically better realize the principle of proportionality in representation. But I want to say one more thing about this, and I'll get a little bit more into the details in just a moment. I want us to be careful not to assume, in the way that these diagrams kind of do, and I'll take you to the next diagram as well. But this is actually about expanding Congress. This is the diagram I want to focus on, and it shows you a little bit about how, when you have single member districts and the capacity to gerrymander, where you draw the lines matter so much, right? And so this is 6 single member districts, and we have a division that's, a little bit more red than the Texas division of the population, but, right, basically 3/5 red, 2/5 blue. there's a way of dividing these voters so that you have exclusive representation of one party, complete exclusion of another party. And then there's a way of drawing the maps, right, where you pack all of the red voters into two districts that they're going to win. You can see these are much less contiguous districts, and then leave the rest of them in districts where they're going to be a minority, and you end up with the opposite, right? Overrepresentation of blue relative to their votes. And this, right, illustrates the idea that as opposed to six districts, you have two districts, that you could have total proportionality. Things would actually turn out exactly as the electorate is divided, which is to say 2 to 1 red to blue, right? Um, or you could maybe gerrymander even with a multi-member district, increase the blue representation to 50% of the representation, even though it's only getting 40% of the vote. Now, having said all that, and this is what I want to be careful to pay attention to, um, I don't think we should assume that changing the mechanism of representation would leave our political identities, our partisan commitments completely intact. What should happen if we're interested in intelligent electoral reform is that as a consequence of changing our districts, and please note, one of the big advantages of multi-member districts, especially if you use the kind of rank or rank choice voting, right? So you can list who your first choice is, who your second choice is, who your third choice is, all the way up to your sixth choice if there are six candidates. And then, right, if your first choice gets 25% more votes than needed to be elected, their votes can be transferred to the candidates who did not get up to the threshold needed to win, right? And then if the least, right, popular candidate doesn't get up to what they need to win, their votes can be transferred to other candidates. And the result is that many more people are voting for a winner. But let me add two more things about this, right? So this is the more concrete in terms of the mechanisms via which proportional representation in single member districts work. Um, the first thing is that primaries can be eliminated, right? You can just have everybody who wants to run on the ballot, or you can have a simple petition. You need to get a certain number of signatures and you end up on the ballot. But we don't need a primary anymore, right? Because this system essentially sorts the winners from the losers without requiring a primary, because you don't need to whittle the field down to two candidates. And the result is that we will remove one of the features that seems to be distorting American politics, which is that the people we vote for in the general election are chosen in primary elections, and a much smaller and much less representative uh, sampling of the electorate turns out for primary elections. They tend to be more ideologically extreme. They tend to be more committed to their party. They tend to be older. They tend to be richer. And so those are the people who are actually choosing who the rest of us get to vote for in the general election. We would have different choices available to us if we used this system of voting. And then, by the way, the fact that candidates don't need to compete for that 20% of the electorate, but have to compete for a majority using a more nuanced and proportional system of representation, likely will moderate the votes of, or I should say, the ideology, the political positions of many of the people running for office. There's also a possibility that would let some more extreme people or marginal people compete as well. Now, in saying all of this, I'm drawing on what's really the kind of classical study of this by G. Bingham Powell, elections as instruments of democracy, majority and proportional visions. And he points out that these are fundamentally distinct accounts of how democracy should work. We have had a majoritarian vision for a long time, going back at least to the 1960s. Please note, by the way, that the system I'm describing to you is a system that was used in the United States for more than a century and a half regionally in different states. It was a system that the Constitution does not prohibit, right? It leaves it up to the states to determine how they want to organize their congressional elections. It is a system we could return to with only ordinary legislation changing the current constriction of the system and giving greater power to experiment to the states. And so I just want to be as clear as possible, right? What Bingham Powell says in this book is you get different kinds of democracy. You get a democracy in which the majority dominates and the minority is essentially excluded until it becomes a majority. By the way, this may result in more stable and less coalition forms of government, or you get a system in which each view, each group, each party is represented in proportion to the share of the vote that it gets. So if in Berkeley, California, 30% of the electorate is Republican, 30% of the representation should be Republican as well. Now, this was all to answer the question at the end of last week's session. I'm going to stop for a second. I see David is here again. Is this making sense? I hope it's not too technical, but I want to make sure that we've got the idea clearly in view that the way in which we organize elections in the United States is not the only way to organize legislative elections. As a matter of fact, we are a distinct outlier, and that we, if we don't like polarization, if we feel that our politicians are non-responsive to the issues we care about, don't just have to wring our hands, don't just have to engage in protests, don't just have to wait for a generational change. There are things we could be doing here and now that would change the way our elections are structured and hence change the way our parties are incentivized to meet our demands, our interests, our ideas. So that's the big idea. And then there's the specific proposal around multi-member districts with proportional representation. Anybody want to ask a question or make a comment at this juncture before I move on? I hope that means that this is making better sense than it was last week. And again, I don't want to lose the forest for the trees. We should not assume that the way in which we organize our democracy is the only or the best way to organize it. If we're dissatisfied with the way democracy is working in the 21st century in the United States, then we can change the institutions. So I'm not suggesting that this one proposal is a fix all, a silver bullet for democratic reform. Clearly, there are countries in the world that have discontent with their democracy that use this system. But I am suggesting that some of the features that we're dissatisfied with, including the hyper partisanship and the incredible polarization of our politics and the way in which the two parties increasingly regard each other simply as enemies or as engaged in a no holds bar contest for power, as opposed to as fellow citizens who have reasonable differences with whom we need to be engaged in discussion and deliberation to work for either persuading each other or compromising with each other, that is rooted in the way in which we structure elections, at least in part. I'm going to push on unless there are questions. So the next thing I want to do is to consider a second set of proposals for reform coming from another pair of leading American political scientists, Benjamin Page and Martin Gillens, and they may be familiar to you in part because we have talked about them before, in part because they're some of the most influential political scientists in the United States today. I'm going to focus on democracy in America, what has gone wrong, and what we can do about it. A book published about 5 years ago, in which Page and Gillens came together to share some really important research that they did. The diagram that I have shared with you many times before from Page and Gillens is this diagram. And I will just unpack it for a moment. It's been described as the most terrifying diagram on American politics. And what it shows is that if there is a correlation, or at least a way of mapping a correlation between the level of support for a piece of legislation and the probability or likelihood that that piece of legislation will actually pass. And if that's one way of measuring democratic responsiveness and accountability, the more support legislation has, the more likely it should be to pass. What Gillens and Page argue is that for average citizens, the bottom 90% of American society, that relationship no longer holds. And as opposed to that, the relative support for legislation makes no difference. And so there is no meaningful responsiveness at the federal level to average citizens' preferences about which laws should be passed, which policies should be adapted. And so this differs from economic elites, and this is probably closer to the way this diagram is supposed to look. As support goes up, so does the likelihood of passage go up. The elite here is defined as the top 10% in terms of income and wealth. And by the way, it looks pretty healthy for interest groups, for people who can afford, or corporations who can afford to hire lobbyists to make large contributions to set up super PACs. As the support for legislation goes up, so too does the likelihood that the legislation will be passed. Now, Gillens and Page are pointing to something that is, I think, quite obvious, which is to say, post Citizens United and kindred decisions, a lot more money is pouring into American politics. And you can see this, right? Expenditure per campaign cycle, with by the time we get to 2016, $2.5 billion being spent in American politics. The diagram doesn't go up to 2020, 2024. We're going to probably spend twice that much in our national elections. The idea that electioneering in the United States has become a multi-billion-dollar industry is an index of how hard it is for average citizens to influence it, because we cannot write the checks that actually matter to this process. One way to see this, again, going forward from 1980 and noting the rapid rise post Citizens United, is how much of this billion-dollar enterprise is funded by the top 0.01% of the American population. And what the data shows is it is 40% or more. Again, this stops at 2016. And I'll just, um, for a moment, pause to mention that there is a fundamentally distinct diagnosis of democratic dysfunction coming from Page and Gillen's as opposed to Levitsky and Sablat. Page and Gillen say, look, yes, we may have a minority of our population who is filled with anger and grievance and looking for scapegoats and wants to blame immigrants and racial minorities and the elite and post-traditional, the woke. But where did they come from? How did they get to be that way? Why is that kind of politics encouraged? And their suggestion is, look, they did it. This is not spontaneous. This is not organic. This is not a grassroots upswelling of populism. This was funded and actually produced, cultivated, curated by a very expensive campaign funded by people like the Koch brothers who wanted to find somebody else to blame other than people like them, other than the very affluent who are obviously benefiting from the skewed distribution of income and wealth that a global economy and a scaling back of regulations and redistributive taxation have created. So it's actually not a problem only or primarily to do with a highly mobilized minority not liking the direction the country is going in. It's fundamentally a problem about money and politics and the way in which post Citizens United, we have become a much more oligarchic kind of society. And so this then leads Gillens and Page to favor different kinds of proposals for reform. And I will just be as quick as possible about this, but I do want to emphasize the point. As you diagnose, so do you prescribe, right? There is a debate here between those who would say the problem really is that a large portion of the American electorate has become Trumpian or MAGA, right? That they really do want this kind of politics. And a diagnosis that says, well, that may be true now, but there's a history, there's a genealogy, and how we got there has a lot to do with the kinds of funding that has entered our political system and with the interest of actually a very narrow portion of the population in distracting from the way in which the organization of politics and the economy redound to their benefit to the disadvantage of almost everyone else. And so what Gillens and Page recommend, first of all, is that we bring the organized interest representation system back to a place where it's more pluralistic, where not only the hyper wealthy are represented by lobbyists or able to influence the kinds of politicians who can viably campaign. And so first proposal, full disclosure of lobbying activity. And here they propose that there be an act of Congress that requires not only full disclosure, but the creation of online accountability so that anybody at any time can see who gave what to whom, who took what from who is in favor of and spending money to get a piece of legislation passed, and that level of transparency will make the manipulation and accountability for it much easier to detect and enforce. Second proposal, stop favor giving and revolving doors. And so this has been particularly in the media of late, especially on the left, with regards to the gifts given to Supreme Court justices by people who have strong interests in cases in front of them being decided one way and not another way, gifts worth millions of dollars that have not been disclosed. But I just want to say, right, this is the grease that runs Congress, right? It's not just the Supreme Court. This idea of constant uh, incentivization, nice conferences you can attend in Boca Raton or beautiful destinations, paid for by and ultimately organized to make credible the ideas of a particular industry, is part and parcel of the way 21st century lobbying works. This is not just right loafer wearing lawyers turning up for congressional hearings or administrative uh, regulation writing hearings. It is much more an effort to court, to coddle, to curry favor with the people who are writing laws and regulations by giving them things that they like. In addition to that, the revolving door, I assume you know what this refers to, but the idea that the people writing the regulations that ultimately are applied to industries very often go very quickly to work for the very industries being regulated, and that when they do so, they carry with them the knowledge of the loopholes and the escape clauses in that legislation that allow the industry to ultimately use the process and the knowledge of the people who wrote the regulations to their advantage. Build government capacity. And so this is, I think, extremely important in much of the rest of the democratic world. The staffs, the civil servants engaged in the administrative state, the staffs of the legislature, um, are more numerous, better qualified, better resourced, and so there's less of a need to rely on lobbyists for information and expertise. We have defunded, scaled back the size of the congressional staff support, and in particular, administrative agencies that engage in regulation writing. And the result is that those people writing laws, drafting laws, and regulations are dependent on the lobbyists to get the information they need to write functional regulations. And I don't want to say that lobbyists don't have a valuable role to play in providing some of that information. But when you are wholly dependent on people employed by an industry you're trying to regulate to give you information about how that industry works, you are also incredibly susceptible to manipulation. And so building up the government's capacity to get its own information about how its proposed regulations are going to work will diminish the need to rely on these lobbyists and industry representatives. Fourth proposal, create people's lobbies. And this is, I think, really interesting. When you fill out your taxes, you check a box, you give a little bit of money to the public financing for a presidential election, $3 a year. What if there were the possibility of checking boxes to also fund lobbyists on environmental issues, on educational issues, and some indication of what the public interest position that would inform that kind of lobbying would be like? What if, as a result of that, as opposed to lobbyists almost exclusively working for private corporations in order to provide them with legislation that allows them to maximize their profitability, there were a whole bunch of public interest lobbyists as well who were working not for corporations, but for taxpayers, but were actually well funded and able to meet the lobbyists head on, the corporate lobbyists head on, with similar resources, similar information, similar levels of preparation and influence. And so this then points to the overall guiding idea here: curate the interest group system to diversify representation. Mm, Part of this would be, frankly, strengthening unions. Unions used to be a countervailing force to corporate lobbying. They are completely outgunned on many issues now because the membership in unions is less than a third of what it was at its high water mark. The result is they have less funding. Recent Supreme Court cases has made it even more difficult for unions to fund their lobbying activities. We need a diverse and representative interest group system if our legislation is going to continue to be as susceptible to lobbying as it currently is. Second set of reforms, and I'll stop after we complete this to open it up for questions. Um, Reforming elections to empower ordinary citizens, and here you will hear the proposals are actually quite similar to those of Levitsky and Zablat. Gillens and Page actually wrote their book first, but I think neither pair of political scientists can claim unique insight here. These are ideas that are many people who study the flaws with American democracy land on. They put the basic problem in simple terms. The voice of the people is both weak and biased, and their suggestion is that among the problems is that the people who vote and who vote in the elections that matter are not representative of the people of the United States as a whole. That in particular, because primary elections matter so much, and because only 20% of the population votes in the primary elections, because they're whiter and more conservative and richer and older, we end up with a skewed choice in our general elections, that it's too hard to register to vote, right? Most other democracies look at us as if we are crazy. How difficult we make it for people to exercise the right to vote, to even attain the right to vote. We should make it universal, right? Voter registration, eliminate the voter suppression temptation by making it a right to easy access to the ballot. Third proposal: unclog the Senate, abolish the hold. This book was written long before Tommy Tuberville was using the hold to block promotions in the military to try to get his agenda through. And by the way, he stopped doing that finally after months of deferred promotions within the military. But there's no reason that an individual senator, especially one from a small state, should be able to block what the rest of the Senate or the rest of the country want us to do. Similarly, limit the filibuster. They don't favor eliminating it completely in the way that Levitsky and Sablat do. And I'll just point out very quickly that Page and Gillens are American political scientists, not comparative political scientists. I think they have maybe a little bit more sense of some of the details and history, including legislative history of American politics. But part of what they're saying is make people actually filibuster, make them actually come to the floor and read for hours or days at a time to hold up the vote. A Mr. Smith goes to Washington kind of filibuster, as opposed to what it is right now, which is a technical exercise which doesn't involve any investment of time, any cost on the individual using it, and also limit the issues on which filibusters can be used, maybe decrease the number of people required for a closure motion to make it such that 55 as opposed to 60 senators can get the legislative ball rolling again. Finally, democratize the House of Representatives. And here they focus on particular the Hastert rule, named after Denny Hastert, and the idea that the majority of the majority party needs to support any legislation for it to come to the floor in the House. And the problem with this, of course, is that a majority of the majority can block legislation, and that often is a minority within the House as a whole. So a second set of reforms, by the way, we're not completely done, but I think we need to be done for today, given the time. But I just again want to emphasize we have two different diagnoses. The problem is that a minority of Americans is drifting to the right due to the fact that we are becoming a more diverse, less traditional society, and our institutions tempts one of our main parties to win elections by catering to that minority view, right? Or alternatively, no, the problem really is that a very rich, very small slice of the population finds it in their benefit to encourage that party to move in that direction, to amplify the sense of grievance and the search for scapegoats on the part of the minority of Americans who are uncomfortable with the direction the country is moving in. And by the way, they do all of that to distract people's attention away from our tax code, away from the deregulation and the effects of the deregulation, away from the way in which the current economic system benefits the hyper wealthy and disadvantages everyone else. If we start having that conversation, they very well may be in trouble. They very well may find that we have an appetite for more redistributive taxation, for more aggressive economic regulation, for better schools, for better healthcare paid for by taxes on corporations, and hence lower corporate profits, right? And so the diagnoses then drive different recommendations for fixing our old institutions. I'll stop there. Who wants to start us out with a question, a thought, a comment today? Gotta unmute yourself, Flossie. Nice to see you. I
Yeah.
hope you're doing well. You did it.
Yes, but I'm still fascinated by the recognition that Trump, who insists that Biden stole the election from him, cannot acknowledge that he stole the election from Hillary Clinton with the help of the Russians. I don't think that's the most important thing in what we face today, but it's a very important little bit of history.
Yes, and I will just note, right, and I'm not talking about it today in detail, but there are now two cases that appear to be headed for the Supreme Court that have to be decided before the federal January 6th election interference case can progress, right? And so the hope, I think, on the part of many people who share your concern is that the case, the actual trial, the presentation of evidence would convince more Americans than are already convinced. And I believe it's, probably approaching 50% of Americans who are already convinced that Donald Trump tried to steal the election in 2020. And I want to be as clear as possible. I don't think there's an equivalence between what happened in 2016 and what happened in 2020. There's no clear evidence that Donald Trump actually supported or coordinated or cooperated with the Russian interference. So there is Russian interference, but was that part of Trump's campaign or was he just the beneficiary of it? We don't have a certain answer to that question. And I think it's unfair to presuppose that we do. And in addition to that, we don't know that the Russian interference tilted the outcome of the election. Again, it's plausible given how close the election was to believe that it did, but we can't establish that beyond doubt, right? And on the other hand, what happened in 2020 is Donald Trump used the power vested in his office to try to overturn the result of an election. And so what happened in 2020 seems to me needs to be the focus, especially if we believe that the fact that somebody once tried to overturn an election is pretty good evidence that they might try to do it again, or again to abuse the power invested in their office to manipulate our votes, our political system, our democracy. And so my hope has been that we would have a national trial before we had a national election. I believed, 6 months ago that this was not very probable. I think Jack Smith and the special prosecutor's office has been very diligent, creative, energetic in trying to get the trial to occur before the elections. But having said that, it's looking less likely that it will. And so I just think again, this is a sobering fact in the background of our politics. David, you've got your hand up. You go ahead. You're still muted.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to share another source of uh, the erosion of the democratic principle. Uh, 2 years ago, I served on a committee in the Department of Education that was controlled by a governing board. And the governing board, because it's education, had adopted the high-minded principle of consensus, that as we wouldn't make a move, it had to do with a new framework for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, where, we test all the kids, we do a sample of testing of kids in the country to determine what the trends are in reading, math, science, and social studies. At any rate, so they decided to operate by consensus on a new framework. Well, a lot of us who worked on the framework wanted to push the framework with a kind of a new theoretical underpinnings reflecting recent research in the field. But 3 people on the governing board asserted the tradition of never having to take a vote, that they achieved consensus on everything with respect to approving new frameworks and new assessments and things like that, which effectively meant that 3 people overrode the wishes of 23 people on the governing board. Just another example of what on the face of it seems like a wonderful collaborative idea, consensus, operating in an anti-democratic way.
And I want to get further into this, but I do want to suggest, in a sense, that what Levitsky and Zablat do, which is to focus exclusively on electioneering and voting, right, misses a huge portion of where the action has migrated to in American politics. It really is not the case that our elected officials determine the content of most of the most effective regulations in our society. As opposed to that, it's advisory boards, it's regulatory
Right.
agencies, it is ad hoc groups, it is treaty organizations. And so one of the things we've got to ask, and this takes us to the second fork, I'm calling it, don't just fix the 18th century stuff that's gotten creaky and antiquated and non-responsive. Yes, ideally we should do that, but let's also recognize that the administrative state is something that frankly our founders didn't even really anticipate would exist. And now it's this huge center of power that, in a sense, is not constitutionally accounted for and not democratically accountable in many instances, and that we need to work on extending democracy to the administrative state. And that's something that is not a reform effort in the sense of taking institutions we already have and making them work better. It is much more an a kind of entrepreneurial, innovative, experimental project. But let us note, right, that the European Union, which is obviously just a tiny little fraction of the age of the United States, and that got to kind of do all of its institution building from scratch because it was not located in a particular nation state with a particular history, has, for instance, done a lot of innovating about how to do administrative law in a more democratically accountable way. And so that's the second fork. That's where we'll have to go next in thinking about democratic experimentation. I think we need to fix our existing institutions, but we need to also beware of, on the one hand, thinking that would exhaust reform, and on the other hand, of the trade-off. Which one of these is our bigger priority? Which one of these has greater likelihood for success if we get serious about democratic reform? All right.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. So much of what happens in government happens through these bureaucratic traditions and regulations and guidelines that have arisen over, decades, if not centuries, and that's where a lot of the action takes place. And by the way, remember that one of the things that Donald Trump has said is that he's going to get rid of all that bureaucracy. But the bureaucracy during his administration was a kind of a ballast, a check on what he could legitimately do.
And I want to say two things about this. The one is that we should want a more democratically accountable and responsive administrative state. And on the other hand, there's a difference between that and autocracy, in which and this was the Dick Cheney program, which has been taken over by the Trump 2025 groups that are working on his second administration. This idea of a unified executive in which everything in the executive branch is ultimately controlled by the chief executive, i.e. the president of the United States, and there's no limitation based on civil service appointment, on the rule of law, on long-standing bureaucratic tradition, civil service competence, or regulation, right? And so yes, we have to be able to thread the needle of making things more democratically accountable without undoing the way in which there are procedural checks and balances built into the administrative state. Yeah, thank you for that comment, David. That's right on, and where we'll be going next. I have bags to pack and a plane to catch. I think I should call it an afternoon. Wonderful being with you guys as always. Do take care, and I'll look forward to seeing you next Saturday. Be well and take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.